Welcome to the third video on ancient Rome and part 2 of the Roman Legion. In the last video, in part 1 of the Roman Legion, we looked at the regal era legions as well as the early to mid-republican legions. Now you will remember that there was a fundamental change to the formation of the mid-republican legions. They moved away from the Greek-styled phalanx and adopted an open-styled formation called the maniple. And this gave the Roman legion greater flexibility as well as a reserve system. So there were some distinct advantages to using this new system. Now, along with those changes to the formation came some critical changes to the equipment as well. And that's what we're going to discuss in this video. Now, I should point out that a lot of the equipment that we'll be discussing came about during the era of the mid-republican legions, but much of this equipment will be used going forward as well. So it's not just relegated to the mid-republican legions, the imperial legions will use it as well. For instance, the Gladius will be used for the next 600 to 700 years. So just bear that in mind. Okay, let's go to the next slide now and break down all of the equipment that the Roman soldier was wearing during the mid-republican era. Now, as I mentioned, closely following the changes to the battle formation came the introduction of new and more effective weapons and armor. The equipment was of thorough workmanship, and the sword in the hands of a Roman soldier could penetrate any armor. And so this sword becomes the primary weapon of the Roman soldier going forward. And once a weapon was adopted, it became the standard. Now, the Romans didn't get rid of the spear altogether. Their long-range default weapon of choice was the Pilon. And so the Pilon and the Gladius represented both distance and hand-to-hand fighting for the Roman soldier. If they needed a ranged attack, they could switch to the Pilon. But mostly the Roman legions always preferred to go to work with the Gladius. So let's take a look at the Gladius first. Now, as I mentioned, the all-time favorite sword of the Romans was the Gladius. And this was essentially a short sword. The grip of the Gladius was made of wood, and the Romans were able to forge the blade of the Gladius with the finest quality steel then available in Western Europe. Ancient chroniclers related that the Romans inflicted severe and shocking blows on their enemies, and that the Gladius could cut off arms and legs and even sever the head of the body of an opponent. So it was a vicious weapon. Now, since the Romans always liked to attack, especially with this new formation, the Gladius became a very important weapon to the Roman soldier. And of course, this is very different from the defensive-themed phalanx, which always favored the long spear. Now, the Romans always used the Gladius with the right hand, so they did not injure the soldier next to them. Because if you have one guy using it in his left hand and another guy using it in his right hand, you can see the obvious problems there. Now, since the Gladius was a short sword, Roman soldiers could slash and stab very quickly, so speed is of the essence. The Gladius originated from Spain. It was here that the Romans encountered Iberian warriors for the first time, and they were serving as mercenaries for Carthage during the Punic Wars. The Iberians had a reputation for designing and manufacturing high-quality weapons, most notably the Spanish sword or Gladius. And as I said before, this would be the standard close combat weapon of Roman infantrymen for almost the next 600 years. Okay, now let's talk about the Pilon. The Pilon was essentially a heavy javelin that eventually all Roman foot soldiers were equipped with. And this also was probably of Spanish design, and like the Gladius, was adopted by the Romans during the Punic Wars. Now, for the first two ranks in the Roman legion, the Pilon replaced a heavy thrusting spear called the hasta, which all Roman soldiers up until the time of the Pilon were equipped with. Now, you will remember the hasta was still used by the last line of Roman defense in the Roman legion, the triarii, but the other formations switched to the Pilon. Now, the Pilon had a barbed point that could easily go through an enemy's shield. They could also toss the javelin about 25 meters, and the Roman soldier might carry 2 or 3 pilums at a time. The Roman soldiers usually tossed their pilum before the close quarters combat began in earnest. This could really inflict some nasty wounds, and it was very difficult for the enemy to pull the pilum out of his shield. And so this had the added benefit of making the shield useless. Now, the default Roman helmet was called the Montefortino. Some troops wore a leather helmet, but most of the heavy infantry used the Montefortino. Now, the helmet was made of bronze, and it also had 2 cheek pieces on the side. The helmet could be tightened with a leather strap under the chin. Now this is an actual Montefortino right here, and you can see it's missing the cheek pieces. But in this illustration right here, the Roman soldier has the cheek pieces intact, and so he would be able to tighten the helmet accordingly. Now this helmet gave the Roman soldier a lot of protection from incoming blows. Now let's take a look at the chest piece. This was called the lorica hamata, or chainmail cuirass. This replaced the original bronze cuirass that was worn previously by Roman soldiers. Now lorica is always the name of a particular chest piece for the Romans, and so this specific type is called the lorica hamata. And as I said, it was essentially a chainmail piece. Now the manufacture of chainmail probably, we don't know for certain, but probably originated from the Celts. But it certainly was not invented by the Romans. So you get the idea here that the Romans are adopting and borrowing a lot of equipment and weapons from their various rivals. And so it's kind of like a greatest hits. The Roman will take all of the best equipment from their enemies and make it their own. Now there was also another lorica made of metal scales, which were either glued or sewed upon stout leather, and you will see that type of lorica in a lot of Roman movies. Now the lorica hamata provided good protection against both slashing and stabbing weapons. The suit of armor was mostly manufactured out of iron, though sometimes bronze was used instead. It was also comprised of several rings that were linked together, and all of these rings formed the entire suit of armor. This produced a very flexible and strong chest piece. Several thousand of these rings would have gone into one lorica hamata, so you can imagine how much work and labor went into producing just one piece. But with good maintenance, they could be used continually for several years, even decades. Now later on, many of the imperial soldiers will use the more famous segmented lorica armor, but the lorica hamata continued to be used, and in fact the late imperial legions would eventually revert almost completely back to chainmail. Okay, let's take a look at the Scouten now, which became the default shield for the Roman soldier during the mid-Republic. The Scouten was a large, rectangular, curved shield. It was almost semi-cylindrical in its construction, and it was made of a stout, well-fitted wood. It was often leather-covered and iron-edged, and often it had a metal knob in the middle of the shield. Now, the Roman soldier became expert in pushing and striking his enemy with this shield. The Scouten was about 20 pounds, and as I just mentioned, it was made of wood, but it actually was made of 3 sheets of wood glued together. This made it extremely sturdy. The Scouten was light enough to be held in one hand, and as you can see there, it was a rather large shield. It covered large portions of the body area of the Roman soldier. And so this made it very unlikely that the Roman soldier would be hit by either missile fire or a weapon in hand-to-hand combat. Now, earlier designs of the Scouten would often shatter from a heavy cutting or piercing blow. This prompted design changes that saw the Romans add thicker planks and metal edges to the shield. The shield was often painted in bright colors and was held using the left arm of the Roman soldier. And as I said, it could be used to bash the enemy in the face. So with all of this armor, the Romans were well protected from head to toe. All Roman soldiers also wore a basic garment under their armor, which was essentially just a tunic that was made of wool. Now I should also point out that the legions had 5 standards. There was an eagle standard, a wolf standard, a minotaur standard, a horse standard, and a boar standard. Each of these animals were associated with the different divisions in the legion. So the Hastati had their own standard, the Triarii had theirs, and so on. Now this would change going forward, where the legions would only carry one standard, which of course was the famous eagle standard. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. In the next video, we will continue on with the Roman legions during the mid-Republic, and we will begin to take a look at the Roman cavalry and some of the specialized units that the Romans began to use more and more of.